The Auditor-General's report number 52 of 2013-14.
Are you moving to take note?
I am.
Senator Fawcett.
Mr President, I'd just like to place on record my appreciation for yet again an excellent report from the Auditor-General, ANAO, and his staff, who have consistently provided very technically accurate and insightful reports into a number of defence procurement activities. The comments in this report support many of the findings that the Senate review of defence procurement in 2012 found, but they don't highlight some of the interactions between defence, between DMO and government, that have shaped the outcomes that have been so accurately reported in the ANAO report. And I'd just like to go to a few of those, because if Australia is to learn from our past mistakes and to make sure that we have successful defence procurement in future, we do need to understand that no part of the defence procurement system operates in isolation, that just as we apply systems engineering concepts to technical equipment, we do actually need to apply the same process to understanding all of the inputs and constituent parts of the process that guides and shapes the efficacy of defence procurement. I note that the report goes into quite some detail talking about the fact that the requirements definition was not as thorough as it could have been. Both the operational concepts document and the functional performance specification were identified as having significant gaps in areas, which then led to the Commonwealth having no contractual basis to require performance from the contractor. As highlighted in the Senate report of 2012, there were a number of reasons for this lack of knowledge, and one of the clearest was that the people with the appropriate skill sets to identify risk, and the ANAO report specifically looks at the degree of immaturity of the platform and the status of its development and certification, that the people who are best qualified to do that are people with developmental test and evaluation expertise. And in fact, the ADF for many years across all three services has funded the training of personnel and the maintenance of organisations to provide those skill sets to support exactly this kind of procurement activity. The interaction, though, of government and the expectations around the outcomes of things like the Kinnard and Mortimer reviews, where there's an emphasis on military off-the-shelf acquisition, means that there becomes a culture where people say, well, we no longer need those skill sets because we're going to be buying things off the shelf. And the risk appetite of the government, of the media, of defence is set around this expectation that everything's going to be off the shelf, therefore all the risk is carried by the contractor. The Commonwealth doesn't need to invest in understanding that. And we saw that with MRH, and again in the Senate report it was highlighted that what is known as a preview evaluation was not conducted, which means that the people who were technically competent to actually identify the risk weren't employed by the Commonwealth to go and do that activity because it is supposed to be a military off-the-shelf acquisition. So the very people who would have been able to say there are problems with maturity weren't tasked because of the expectation that was set by government to defence. That also flowed through, and if you read in the report, you'll find there is a table there where they look at certain elements of capability that they said were poorly defined, and they highlight the fact that there was a pre-contract functional performance specification as well as a contract functional performance specification. Now, it's some years ago, and so I'm happy to be corrected, but my strong recollection when I used to run the ADF's flight test organisation was that some of the people who worked for me were working within the acquisition organisation, helping to create the functional performance specification pre-contract and faithfully following Defence's laid down procedures of tracing requirements from the operational concept document to what that meant functionally for the actual platform. But the directive came through quite late in the process that this is a military off-the-shelf aircraft. We're not going to be able to change anything anyway, so take out all of those detailed requirements because we will live with what we are delivered. Now, the flaw with that has now been shown in that whilst the government and defence seek to minimise risk in the acquisition process by going for an off-the-shelf acquisition, the people who have to operate the aircraft, and normally the service chief is the responsible person, the airworthiness authority for that particular platform, and he or she is responsible to make sure that it is safe for the people who are using it. And there are a number of standards that they need to meet in terms of things like crashworthiness or the ability of the aircraft to operate in a given environment, for example, by night. And so whether you're talking about crashworthy seating, whether you're talking about things like the infrared searchlight that's used when operating by night, these were things that were flagged ahead of the contract, and yet because it was then delivered as we'll take what we get, the service chief couldn't put his hand in his heart and send people into the field with that, and so it's now had to be rectified at some considerable cost. And so this interaction of government expectations drives a deficient functional performance specification in the contract, which then drives further cost and delays in the actual program. And so we do need to step back collectively as the executive on this side of the lake, with defence on the other side of the lake, and with industry, and be open about the fact that if we are going to acquire capability that is modern, current, there is a good chance that there will be some technical risk. It's not always the case, but it often is. And if we pretend that we can either transfer all the risk to industry, or if we pretend that risk doesn't exist, we will end up again and again being disappointed. Government, the media, industry, defence need to recognise that there will be risk. We need to retain the skill sets in the appropriate organisations within defence so that they can be tasked to identify the risk, because only when it's been identified, when our systems are transparent enough that that is then elevated to the appropriate decision makers, can we then manage the risk. And if that risk had been identified and managed earlier, and we've seen the same things in the aircraft that's a refuelling aircraft, with the armed reconnaissance helicopter, with other defence projects, if it had been identified and then managed and expectations had been managed, then both the schedule and the cost would have been managed in a way that defence would have got the capability it wanted when it expected it, could have retired its legacy capabilities, had its postings in place for its people, as opposed to having high expectations of a quick delivery, which hasn't resulted. It also unfairly blames particular types of aircraft. People are making the comment that European aircraft are dreadful, we should never go there again, we should only buy aircraft from the US. They forget perhaps that in the early days of the Black Hawk fleet, again because of spare parts and other design issues, that the availability of that fleet was very low, and it took some time for it to reach the mature capability that it's now demonstrated. So with both ARH and MRH, I'm sure that in time they will develop to be very capable aircraft. There are still some inherent issues with the MRH in terms of things like the door gun, and the fact that that impedes the roping device and the ability for people to get through the door while the gun is in place. And that will, I think, be a lifelong issue that, again, could have perhaps been picked up had a preview evaluation been done. But the reality is that any capability is a system of systems, and we need to look at the role of government, defence, industry, even the media in terms of setting expectations and schedule pressures, so that we work collaboratively to understand those elements and to work towards a system where we identify risk and manage it, so that the taxpayer can be assured that their money is being used effectively, and we can be assured that the men and women in our defence force have the equipment that is safe and fit for purpose to achieve the tasks that we give them. I seek leave to continue my remarks.